Hi, guys. Welcome. Mary Beth Temple here from Hooked for Life Publishing, here again on behalf of the Knitting Circle. And today we're going to make this cool slip stitch dishcloth. Now, I have to say, when I looked at this pattern, I was like, not so very exciting. But when you see it up close and personal, it really is a lovely, lovely stitch pattern that we're going to learn. So it's really easy to do as well. There's only 4 rows in this repeat. So because we've only got the 4 rows that we have to do, I'm going to start at the very beginning. So if you're a beginner, stick around. This is for you. The first thing we're going to do is a long tail cast on, because it says specifically in the pattern to use the long tail cast on. So this is just random yarn, random chunky yarn and a bigger needle. So you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to start, I'm going to leave a nice long amount of yarn. I'm not going to start real super close to the end. Now, I was always taught that an arm's length or a little more would be about 30 stitches on a size 8. A lot of people I hate long tail because I don't know how much yarn to pull off at the beginning. My theory is better too much than too little, because if there's too much, you can just cut the tail shorter. If there's not enough, you're going to have to rip it out and start over, and that can be irritating. So I'm going to begin by making my slip knot, which is I'm going to make my circle. You can see that it's twisted. And I'm going to reach in here, grab my thing, and pull it through. You know what? I think I'm mirrored again. One of these days, I'm going to remember to not do that. But today was not that day. So give me 1 second, y'all. We're just going to hang out here while I unmirror my camera. Friendly host, you're fired. You were supposed to remind me. Not really. Friendly host is awesome. And let's see. I'm so sorry. I will one of these days remember to do this ahead of time, but today was not the day. Okay. Well, I can't figure it out while we're live. Friendly host, if you want to remind me where to hit where that button is that I need to hit, I would be eternally grateful. Okay, so I have my slip knot, and I'm putting it on my knitting needle. Oh my goodness, now I can't even see myself. All right. So I put my slip knot on my knitting needle. I'm going to tighten that up by pulling on the working yarn. So the working yarn is what we call the yarn that is attached to the ball of yarn or the skein of yarn. And the yarn that is just hanging out in the world, the cut end, we call that the tail yarn. So I'm going to insert my index finger and my middle finger between the 2 strands. My tail yarn is towards me and my working yarn is away. Hold on 1 second. Hi, Felicia. Hello from Greensboro, North Carolina. And Friendly Host has just told me that how to fix this mirror issue. And if I go to fix that, the camera's going to blink off for a second. Again, I apologize completely. Settings. I'm still here. Again, I apologize, you guys. This is entirely my fault. I can't find the unmirror thing, so we're just gonna not mess with it, I don't think. All right. Oh, and Linda's in Alexandria, Virginia. Hello to you. So once again, I'm going to take my needle. I'm going to put it under my front strand, take it over my back strand, and pull it through. You know what? We're going to start this over. Here is my slip knot. I'm going to put that onto my needle. give it a little tug. My tail yarn is to the front, my working yarn is to the back. Working yarn is attached to the skein. The tail yarn is the cut end. We're going to go under the front strand, the very, very front strand, and stick our needle in there. So it's in that loop that we're making with our thumb. Then we're going to go over the back, grab that back strand and pull it through. And then I'm tightening it. You can see I'm using my thumb to tighten the stitch. So that slip knot counts as our first stitch. And we do have our second stitch. And so once again, my fingers are through. I always say you're making a V for victory. There is your V. So I'm going under my front strand and then under back to front my back strand. Now watch, as I'm pulling this through, I'm taking my thumb out and using it to tighten up the stitch. So you can do this pretty quickly once you get the hang of it. And you're going to cast on for a total of 35 stitches. So remember that slip knot that we put at the beginning, that does count. And then the next thing we're going to do is knit one row. And it's telling you knit one row on the wrong side. WS is wrong side. So it's letting us know that because sometimes right side and the wrong side of a pattern are different. So here is our knitting one on the wrong side. And that is our bottom edge. So now I'm going to go back over to the dishcloth that I have already started so that you can see the stitch pattern. And this is what I was talking about with the right side being different than the wrong side. So here is the right side. And you can see we have these little elongated stitches. That's what happens when you knit a slipped stitch. When you slip a stitch, it elongates. And then when you knit it, it's showing up as a little elongated. And then here's my little sort of clumps of garter stitch. I have these little 3-stitch groupings, and you can see that they stagger all the way across. Now on the back, it's actually not a terrible looking pattern. It's a little bit loosey-goosey. Now, the other thing I want to point out is I'm knitting at a fairly loose gauge here, and that is because I want you to be able to see what's going on. I want to not be struggling with my stitches. I want to see what's up. When you are knitting at home and you are working in dishcloth cotton like this is, you want to knit at a tighter gauge, because when your dishcloth or your washcloth, when it gets wet, it tends to spread out a little bit. So if you want to use this to exfoliate your lovely face or to scrub a pot or a pan, you want this to be a super tight gauge so that when the water hits it, it doesn't get lacy. It relaxes just a little bit, but is still useful. So on the right side, we're doing row 1 and it says RS, which is right side. So we're going to knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Now it says SL1 WYIB, and that is slip 1 with yarn in back. So the yarn being in the back is away from me. And you'll notice as we go through this pattern, we're always slipping the yarn so that it's on the wrong side of the work. We are never slipping the yarn on the right side of the work, whether the right side is facing us or the wrong side is facing us, that's going to matter as we're knitting. So we're going to slip 1 with yarn in back. So to slip it, I'm just moving it from one needle to the next. I'm not twisting it, I'm not knitting it, I'm not purling it, I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm just moving it from one needle to the other needle. And my yarn is already in the back, so I don't have to move it. So I'm going to slip 1 with yarn in back. I'm going to bring that yarn across the back of the slipped stitch and knit 3, because that's my repeat. So we have knit 3. It's the end of that first repeat. And now it says repeat from asterisk to end. So all the way across, I'm going to slip one with yarn in back. I'm not doing anything to the stitch. I'm just moving it from one needle to the other. Yarn's already in the back, so I don't have to do anything. Knit 3. Now I want to talk a little bit about this yarn in back, or the yarn in front when we get to the alternate rows. This is what we call a float. When yarn travels behind a stitch and is not used, that is called a float. Now, the trick with floats in any kind of knitting, we talked a little bit about this on the coaster class, the Steeking Basics class. So if you're interested in learning more about floats, that's a really good class for you to, that's another live that you can go look at that we did a lot of information there about floats. You don't want to pull your floats super tight, because if you pull them too tightly, it'll draw in widthwise and not be attractive. And if you make them too loose, you can catch yourself on them. You can catch a fingernail. The stitch might come out of true. It won't be so neat. And so you really want to make sure that your slips, your floats, you can see they're keeping the tension, they're keeping the gauge like the rest of my stitching. Again, if we pull them too tight, the work's going to squish this way. And if we make them too loose, those stitches are going to be loosey-goosey and they're not going to be pretty. So we're going to do this all the way across to the end of row 1. Now, Tracy has just asked, what is the purpose of slipping stitches in knitting? Is it just for looks? There are 2 instances in which you will slip stitches inside the work. Sometimes we slip them on the edge, on the selvage edge, because it leaves a nice edging. But if you're doing it inside the work, there are 2 reasons. One is because, now this is super technical and I apologize, but that's what you get when you ask me questions. I have lots of technical information that I like to impart. So when you slip a stitch, you're not knitting it. And so a slipped stitch is taller than a regular stitch, but it's shorter than, say, 2 rows of knitting. You're not knitting it. So it does one of 2 things. In this pattern, it adds texture. It's giving me texture because it's making these little garter stitch trios. It's making them really pop out because the pulling on the work a little bit because of that slip stitch. The other reason that we use slip stitches a lot is in color work. So if I had been knitting this in 2 colors, the slip stitch brings the color up over the second color. So if I had knit a slip stitch row in blue, and then I knit the next row in white, when I go back and knit that slip stitch, the blue has popped up over the white. So it's a color work pattern. So slip stitches give you inside the work. Again, on the edge, they do a completely different thing. But inside the work, they do 2 things. They give you texture. And if you're doing color work, it gives you a way to see multiple colors in one row while still only knitting with one color at a time. So that is the end of my row 1. Now we're going to row 2, which is a wrong side row. Again, I have been working on this piece for a little bit. I have put some rows on it so you could see the pretty stitch pattern. If you are just starting out, sometimes you can get a little confused at the beginning when you're setting up your pattern about which is the right side and which is the wrong side. And if that is the case, I would recommend getting like a locking stitch marker, like a crochet stitch marker, and using that to mark the right side of the work so that you don't get confused at the beginning, particularly if you have to, you're interrupted, you have to put your work down, or you're not going to knit an entire dishcloth in one evening. You're going to need to know which is the right and which is the wrong side. So for row 2, it says knit 3, 1, 2, 3, and now it says slip 1 WYIF, or with yarn in front. So now I have to get the work in front because that's what it's telling me. And I'm going to still slip the stitch in the same way. Going to slip it from one needle to the next without doing anything to it. And now my next stitch is a knit stitch. So I have to get that yarn to the back so I can knit my stitch. So I'm going to knit 3. 1, 2, 3. So we're going to bring the yarn in front, slip a stitch, put the yarn in the back so we can knit it. 1, 2, 3. Let's do that one more time. Bring the yarn in front. Make sure you're bringing it between the needles. If you bring it over a needle, you're going to accidentally make a yarn over, and you don't want that. Let's see, my cable's in my way here. So that was knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Now the other thing I want to talk about, so we're on a wrong side row, which we know because that's what the pattern tells us. But the other thing I want to point out, if you get, so there are 4 rows in the pattern, and there are 2 pairs. So on row 1, the right side row, you're slipping stitches. On row 2, the wrong side row, you are slipping the same stitches that you slipped on the right side row. Now for row 3, you're going to slip alternating stitches to get our stitch pattern, but on row 4, you're going to slip the same stitches you slipped in row 3. So one way to learn this pattern, to read your knitting, which we always encourage, and one of the things you want to just pay attention to is on the wrong side, on every wrong side row, the stitches you are slipping are the same stitches that you slipped in its companion right side row. So if you get to a stitch that you think you're meant to slip and you're on the wrong side and it's not one you slipped before, you probably have an error in your pattern, and now is a good time to figure it out. And how can I tell it's the same slipped stitch? If you look, let's see how close we can get. If you look, you can see the float. You see the float is right over my index finger, so I know that was a slipped stitch because there's a float behind it. So again, if you just want to cruise along and knit this pattern, it really is very easy, but I like to talk about how fabric is made and technique and stuff like that, so that's why we're here. So how many stitches did we cast on? If you follow along with the pattern, it tells you to cast on 35. So that is what I did. And then you're going to knit 1 on the row on the wrong side. So here I'm at the end of my row. I've slipped 1 with yarn in front, knit 3. So that's the end of row 2. Now for row 3, it's the same idea as row 1, but we want to move the slip stitches. So again, let's take a look. If you look at these stitches on my needle, you can see the slipped stitches because they're elongated. Those are the stitches that I slipped. Now, again, talking about how fabric is made with slip stitches, if I kept slipping the same stitch over and over and over, what would happen? I wouldn't have any height. I'd have a big ruffled mess. So for this stitch pattern, and for many slipped stitch patterns, we're going to change the stitches that are slipped from here to the center of our 3. So if you look at this, you see the 3 stitches in a row. We're going to slip the center one. And again, all of this is written out in the pattern, but I like to tell you how we figure these things out so that if you're just relaxing and watching television, or you're sitting by the fire pit or whatever, we want you to be able to relax, and we call it reading your knitting, without having to look at that pattern every given moment. So on row 3, we're going to knit 1, slip 1 with yarn in back, which we already know that skill, and knit 3. So the only difference between row 1 and row 3 is that row 1 begins with a knit 3 and row 3 begins with a knit 1. Now here's one more trick for you to, again, read your knitting and see if you're on the right track. When I have my slipped stitch and my knit 3s, remember how I said the slip stitch is going to be the center of that 3 knit group? The other thing you can think about is your 3 knit group is going to have a slip stitch in the center. So once again, if I'm sitting and I'm knitting and I'm not looking at the pattern real close, I may not be paying a whole lot of attention, but I can look at the knitting that is on my needles And I know that I'm right. I know that I'm doing the right row. And if I make a mistake real quick, it's real quick to figure it out. It's easier to figure it out right after you have made an error than 5 rows past it on any stitch pattern, not just this one. So we're going to end this with a knit 1. So we're beginning and ending with the same number of stitches. So for row 1, we started with knit 3, we ended with knit 3. For row 3, we started with knit 1, we ended with knit 1. One, 2, 3, slip 1, and then knit 1. Okay, so there's our stitch that we slipped on row 1 and 2, and you can see how elongated that is. As we continue with our stitch pattern, those elongated stitches sort of recess a little bit, but I really do like this pattern. It's a really nice texture. So our final row, row 4, what are we going to do? We're going to begin and end with knit 1, and we're going to slip our stitches with the yarn in front, and we're going to knit the same stitches. We're going to slip the same stitches that we slipped on the previous row. So there's our knit 1. Now I got to get that yarn to the front, slip the stitch, take the yarn to the back, knit 3. So this is all you need to do to make this dishcloth. You have the technique, and of course our friendly host will put the download link so you can download the free pattern. So following along with the pattern, it tells us to repeat rows 1 through 4 another 12 times, and then rows 1 and 2 once more, and that's just to make the bottom look like the top. And then it says, see, and I made a mistake, and I can catch it because I looked. There we go. Let's see. There's my slipped stitch and 3 knits. 1, 2, 3. I can talk and knit at the same time, but apparently I can't talk, knit, and read a pattern at the same time. And then it tells you to knit 2 rows and bind off loosely on the right side. And then using a tapestry needle, weave in the end. So you just have an end at the beginning and an end at the end. And that's all there is to this dishcloth. If we have any more questions, now is a really good time to ask. And if not, what I'll go ahead and do, I'm just going to do the bind off real quickly, again, just so that you have all of the patterns that all of the technique that you need, we've shown in the video. And it says we're going to bind off on a right side row, which I'm about to do. The only difference is going to be that if you knit 2 rows, you'll have all knit stitches here, not slip stitches. So when you look at what I'm doing, you'll see some slip stitches, but that's because I did not put those last couple of knit rows on. So all I'm going to do for this bind off, and I use this bind off all the time, I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches, 2, and I'm going to take the first one and pass it over the second one and let it drop. And it's caught on there, it's not going to go away. So I have 1 stitch on my needle. Then I'm going to knit the next one. So you knit 2 at the beginning and then 1 at a time. Pass the first one over the second one. Knit the next stitch. So you've only ever got 1 stitch or 2 stitches on your needle. You're never going to have a whole bunch for this particular bind off. And we're going to go do this till the very end, and then we'll cut a tail and pull it through. Once again, if you have any more questions, now is a good time to ask, but you do definitely want to go download that pattern while you have it. And with holidays coming up, I am really big on knitting dishcloths, washcloths, these kind of things. Again, because they don't take a whole lot of brain power and they don't cost a whole lot. kitchen cotton, dishcloth cotton as we call it, is a very inexpensive yarn. This and a bar of soap, this and some bubble bath, this and a little kitchen thing makes a terrific gift. And this is the kind of thing that I might have just a couple extra laying around in the closet in case I ever get caught up short and need a quick gift for the holidays, or maybe a shower, or maybe a teacher gift, or something where you just want a little something, but it looks very fancy because you made it yourself. And of course, you can do any color that you like. This would be, to match your kitchen, or if you prefer to use it for a washcloth, to match your bathroom. I'm going to get to the very end here in a minute. If we have any more questions about slip stitching, now is your chance. In any case, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I'll do that while I'm getting to the end, and then we'll just cut the yarn. Once again, I'm Mary Beth Temple from Hooked for Life Publishing, and I'm here today on behalf of the Knitting Circle. And if you are not a Knitting Circle member, you should be, because there's all kinds of wonderful information, including patterns and tutorials that you can get access to, and it will really expand your knitting horizons. Just get right here to the end. The faster I rush, the bigger mess I make. Here we go. We got our last couple stitches. Here we are at the end. So now I have one stitch left. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to cut my yarn, leave myself a tail. I like to leave 4 to 6 inches to weave in. And then I'm just going to grab that tail, pull it through the loop all the way through, and give my cut end a tug. And now it will not come undone. And there is my bind off. You see I have that nice even bunch of stitches. I have a nice smooth bind off. So that's a very simple bind off to use. And that would be the end of my dishcloth. So once again, thank you so much for joining me here, and I'll see you again next time for the Knitting Circle.